So what we have is we have a series of WebExes that are going to be taking place this week and next week. And as you can see from the agenda, it's going to start relatively very basic, and throughout the WebExes, it's going to become a little bit more advanced as we go along. Now, some of this, for some of the seasoned support guys that we have on the line, this may be a review session that may be quite basic, and some of you that are quite new may not have seen any of the information. So we're going to start quite basic, as I mentioned, and we're going to move along to some things that are more advanced. So in this first session, we're just going to talk about some things about SAS in general. We're then going to go through and review onboarding. We're going to look at some of the errors and some of the troubleshooting that you have with onboarding. We're going to be adding users manually, adding users from a file, and we're going to move on to the sync agent, where we're going to connect an LDAP store, sync it, and connect a SQL user store and sync it. So we're going to start with a very basic diagram, and as we progress through the rest of the sessions, we will continue to add components to this diagram. So this first session, we're going to start with a sync agent, connecting to an LDAP, connecting to a SQL store, and then synchronizing that data into SAS Cloud. So the first thing I wanted to just go over is what this particular WebEx is going to cover. So we're going to discuss the SAS Cloud details so that we all know where everything is in SAS Cloud, all the URLs and IPs. We're going to go through onboarding. We're going to add users manually. We're going to import users from a file, and we're going to sync both an LDAP user store and a SQL user store. So the first item on the list is the SAS Cloud details. As you can see, we have the URL for accessing the console, and again, we redirect everybody to HTTPS with this URL. You can also see the self-service URLs, we can see the self-enrollment URLs, and we can see the LDAP sync agent URLs. We can also see the URLs for the agents, and then we can see the IP addresses for the Radius servers. There's a PDF embedded inside of this PowerPoint presentation, which I'll make available, and it basically has all these details inside. So I've left some time, just to review, I've left some time at the end for any questions. So if you have any questions, save them till the end, and we'll have a short question and answer session at the end. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about onboarding. And there's a process for onboarding, which is getting a customer onto SAS Cloud. And the steps that are involved in onboarding is we are going to create the account. We're then going to set up the services. We're going to allocate capacity and tokens to that account. We're going to create operators, and we're going to define an authentication node. Now inside this series, I have made a number of videos. They're available online. I'll make this package available so that you can actually have the videos local, and there are a few websites that I want to point out as well. So the first thing, that inside the SAS package, we actually have some pre-built websites. So I'm going to start with just explaining to you what these look like. So you can see here, this is what the onboarding website looks like. These are part of a series of 3 websites that are inside the SAS package, and it basically takes you through the steps to do that particular onboarding. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at what onboarding consists of. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create an account. And the minimum requirement to create an account is an account name. We have the ability to retain some address information, some billing information. On the right-hand side, you'll notice we have three custom fields. These can be relabeled, and this allows you to perhaps generate reports based on certain fields that you may need. For example, I've seen the custom one field being used for things like account number. So you can search based on the account name and you can find information about the account number. Now, one thing I want to point out here is we also have a group, the ability to define group. And what this allows me to do is this allows me to create my accounts and define which of my account managers are able to access specific groups. So if I'm a service provider and I have 10 different subscriber accounts, and I only want my account managers to manage certain accounts, then what I would do is when I onboard the account, I would put them into a specific group, and then I would promote the user, I would then have the account manager defined within a group for management. There's some information in each of the modules that you can see that tells you some information about what we're doing inside this particular module. So we click on Save. That will then save this account. We can move on to the next step, which is the account services. So we can activate the account. We can choose whether the account is evaluation, whether they're a subscriber, which is a child company with no multi-tier, multi-tenancy, or whether they're a service provider with multi-tier, multi-tenancy. I can define my service period when it starts. I can provide my service period when it stops, and I can define my billing frequency. I also have the ability to define the maximum number of authentication nodes that this account is permitted to have. The delegation of management, this is a three-step process where you can create a delegation code, share it with another subscriber company, and here we're able to retain the information about the contact that we'll be sharing that code with. So we go ahead and we click on Save. We have now saved the account services. The next step, we're going to allocate some capacity and allocate some tokens into this newly created account. So the first thing we can do is we can select what it is we want to allocate. In this example, I'm going to allocate rental, and I'm going to allocate some tokens, whether they're with capacity or not. I can allocate in case of emergency credits. I can also allocate SMS credits. So allocating some tokens, in this example, I'm going to choose some multi-platform tokens. I can see I have 168 available to me in my inventory. I click on that I want to allocate 10 of those tokens to the subscriber company. I click on search. It gives me the next tokens based on serial number. I select those next 10 tokens and I click on next. I now have the ability to define my billing references. So I can choose what the billing basis is on. I can choose what the rate of those tokens and capacity are on. I can define a reference, and I can also put in some comments regarding this. You can see we also have the ability to define if they're a warranty replacement or evaluation. We now confirm, and we can see that we now have 10 capacity and 10 tokens inside the account. I can also allocate just capacity. So I can define the number of capacity that I wish to add, define my billing reference for the capacity, choose whether it's an eval or warranty replacement, and continue with this allocation. The reason why we would allocate just capacity is for customers that may have existing oath tokens and they wish to allocate them to the system. And you can see, you can go through and you can define the different types of tokens. So we can see we've got capacity and tokens of different types that are now within my inventory. The last thing I'm going to do, I'm going to allocate some SMS credits. You can see I have some credits available. I'm going to select how many credits I want to allocate to this company, define my billing reference, and then confirm, and these credits will then be allocated to that particular company. You can see we have a transaction log, and this basically will list all the different transactions that have happened within this account. By clicking on the transaction ID, I can actually see the serial numbers of each of the tokens and the token type that I have allocated to my child company. The next step is we're going to create an operator. To create an operator, we click on Add, and we must define the minimum requirements, which is a first name, a last name, a user ID, and an email address. We can also harvest the billing information. We have some custom fields, 1, 2, and 3, and we also have the ability to define aliases. So having different user IDs to the same token. We click on Next. This allows us to now choose the authentication method. So because I have tokens in inventory, I can choose which tokens I want to allocate to this specific user. And we can see now our operator has been created, and we have a token currently in the pending status. The next step within onboarding is the authentication nodes. This is where we're adding the Radius client or a SAS agent IP address. In authentication nodes, the minimum requirement is some type of description name and an IP address. Because it's Radius, we also need to define the shared secret. We click on Save, and this auth node is now being added to the system, and within a few minutes it will be live. Again, we have a change log, so we can see any changes or modifications that have been made to the authentication nodes. The last thing we have on onboarding is the ability to harvest some additional contact information. So there may be a case where a user of the system or a contact is not harvested inside the system, so we have the ability to harvest some information about some additional contacts, perhaps somebody within procurement or somebody in the business unit. And that completes the onboarding process. So let's take a look at some of the requirements for onboarding. So as I mentioned before, the minimum requirement to add an account is an account name. The maximum length of the account name is 64 characters in total. When we create an account, it may be that the account name is already in use. So we may receive an error that says you cannot add a new account to the database, contact your administrator. In most cases, this means that there is a duplicate account name when onboarding. When we're activating the service, it may be the service period that we're trying to define for this particular account. The stop date cannot be longer than the parent. So you will receive an error that the account date cannot be later than the parent account date. So to rectify this, we need to define a service stop date that's within the end date of the parent. When we allocate tokens, one of the questions that comes up quite frequently to myself is, now that I've allocated tokens, how do I deallocate? And you can see here, there are some hyperlinks under the capacity and under the tokens. You click on these links, and that will begin the deallocation process. When we're allocating some capacity or capacity and tokens, you can see we have the total available and the amount that we wish to allocate. Of course, if we try to exceed the amount available, we will receive a little red star under the capacity to allocate, which means we cannot allocate more than it is available to this particular company. When we're allocating tokens, you need to define at least one in the quantity in order to allocate that token to your subscriber company. So entering in a value under quantity and clicking search will give us that ability. If we try to search for a specific token that's not in the inventory, we'll receive an error that is a non-existing serial number. Again, if you try to allocate more than it is available, you will see a small star under the red star under quantity, where you cannot allocate more than it is available within the parent company. When we're allocating SMS credits, again, we can go ahead and allocate the amount that is required. If you choose to allocate more than is within your inventory, again, you'll receive a little red star that means that you cannot allocate more than that you have inside your inventory. Again, when you're onboarding the operator account, the minimum requirement to create an operator account is a first name, a last name, a user ID, and an email address. You define the token type or the authentication type. You will see you have an available column, and you also have what's being reserved for provisioning tasks. So when a user is provisioned with a token, there is an enrollment policy that it adheres to. And again, for example, the default is 10 days, so that token will be held in a provisioning task for 10 days. If the user account already exists, you will receive an error that you cannot create a new operator because the user already exists. When a user is created as an operator, they go through an enrollment process which activates their token. They will then receive a second email. Now, if you take a look at the URL, you'll actually see there is a validate code. And the user must click on this link, log in with their email address and the code from the token that they've just enrolled in order for their account to become active. And you can see under the validation status, you can see that we have one user that's active, we have one user that's pending. The pending user has not completed the token enrollment and the operator validation, so they will stay in a pending state. On the authentication nodes, you can see here there's 3 items I want to point out. The first item is the primary and secondary radius IPs. These are pointing to both our UK and Canadian data center. We can see our URLs for our agents. They communicate on port 443. And we can see the maximum number of auth nodes allowed. In this case, it's 10. And that's defined at the services which we've just completed. So when we add an agent node, there are 2 things that can authenticate with SAS. One is radius, one is agents, and the agents are also include APIs, the Java and .NET based APIs. So we must register these auth nodes against SAS in order for them to be able to authenticate. So the minimum requirement is a description and a IP address. When we're adding a radius node, again, the minimum requirement is a description, an IP address, and a shared secret. It may take a few minutes for the authentication node to be registered. So troubleshooting auth nodes, you will know that you cannot add multiple or duplicate IP addresses of the same value. So in this case, if I'm trying to add the same value, I'll receive an error that cannot add a new auth node, contact your administrator. This means that 5909, this IP address is already registered somewhere on the system. If you try to add more auth nodes than you're permitted, so in my example, the max number of auth nodes was 10. If I'm trying to add more than 10 IP addresses for that particular auth node, I will receive an error that cannot add new auth node, contact your administrator. You already have the maximum number of auth nodes configured. So that's onboarding. The next thing I want to show in this webcast is adding SAS users. And there are three ways that I'm going to show how to get users into the system. The first way is creating user manually. The second way is importing from a file. And the third way is synchronizing with the agent. So again, we have some videos here that are available online and are going to be locally available inside this package. So on the virtual server tab, we've selected our subscriber account. We've now clicked on the assignments tab. You can see on the right-hand side, there's information about this particular module. And what I'm going to do is on the far left-hand side, under shortcuts, I'm going to click on Create User. The minimum requirement to create a user for adding users manually is a first name, a last name, a username, and an email address. If I wish to provide this token with this user with an SMS token, I will need to define my mobile or SMS number. I click on Add. This user has now been added to the system. I'm now going to import users from a CSV file. So I click on Import Users. I choose my delimiter. I then choose the file that I wish to import. So in this case, I've built a file called CSV. And this file has 6 comma-separated values: first name, last name, username, email address, and mobile number. You'll notice that CSV file did not have a header row, so I remove the checkbox for has header row, click on Next, and then I have my mapping fields. So you can see on the far right is my import data, and on the left I have my database field. So I'm going to map my first name to first name, last name to last name, user ID to user ID, email to email, and mobile number to the mobile number field. I click on Next. I can then choose which container I wish to import, and I have some options on whether to import if this user information exists already. So like I mentioned, to create a user manually, there are some minimum requirements of first name, last name, user ID, and email address. If I try to add a user and that user already exists in the system, I will receive an error that the username already exists. When I import from a file, I choose my delimiter, I choose my import file, I map my import data, and I choose to import. And again, here's the options. Do not import if the user ID exists, or update the user record if the user ID exists in the database. Now, there's a few error messages that we can have during importing. For example, if we have imported, we will see in the log that the user already exists in the system as part of my import results. If my import file does not have a header row, and I've chose to use the header row, I will receive an error that we do not have a header row in the CSV file. If the CSV file is not formatted properly, we will receive an error message that the import file is not formatted, and we would need to modify our CSV file to import that again. So that's creating users manually. That's importing users from a CSV file. We'll now move on to the sync agent and syncing this environment with an Active Directory or LDAP. So there are some system requirements for the LDAP sync agent. We do support it on pretty much every Windows platform: XP, 2003, 2008, Vista, 7, 8, 2012. We do provide packages both in 32 and 64-bit. We do have some network ports, so SAS communicates on TCP 8456. We communicate to the LDAP on 389 or 636. And again, depending on which SQL, you'll see that in the next section, which SQL we're syncing, there are ports also that are mandatory as well. We're only going to be reading the schema from the LDAP, and we support single, multiple LDAPs. We support AD, we support Sun1, we support Novell eDirectory, and on the SQL side, we support Microsoft SQL, MySQL, Postgres, and Oracle as a user store. So let's go ahead and take a look at the LDAP sync agent. So the first thing I'm going to do is inside SAS, I'm going to download my BMC file. I move the BMC file to where I have the agent installed, and I click on Add to load the file. I now move to the Configurations tab, and the first thing I need to do is tell the agent where my LDAP is. By importing the BMC file, the agent knows how to contact SAS. So when I need to tell the agent how to contact LDAP, I need to define the host name or IP of where my LDAP is, my port, whether or not I'm using SSL, and any failover hosts. I choose my schema. In this case, it's found in Active Directory. So I provide my username, my password for my Active Directory service account. I define my base DN, so where my users are located. And now the agent knows where both the SAS is from the BMC file and knows how to contact my Active Directory based on my configuration user source settings. So the next step is I need to define which group I'm going to be monitoring. I can then start the agent, and we can see I have a transaction, the date and time. I have some users that have been found. Now, by default, the very first synchronization that is performed will be set to pending, because any connection from agents to the sync agent, any connections from the sync agent to SAS, the very first sync is denied. So we need to go back into the SAS UI. So I'm back into my SAS UI. You can see these were the settings I used to download my BMC file. So persist operators against sync. This means that if I have an operator already in the system and I choose to synchronize that user ID, that operator will stay persistent. Using the delayed sync removal will mean that the syncing, the processing of the sync, will happen after a 24-hour period. So if I click on my LDAP sync agent hosts, I will now see my LDAP sync client that is registered. By default, this is set to not allow the connection. So I need to click on allow, click apply, and now we're allowing that sync agent to speak with SAS. So I go ahead and I stop and start my agent now that I'm allowing the connection. I can refresh my transaction details. These are the 3 users that I have within the group, the SAS software tokens that I'm synchronizing into the SAS Cloud. I stop and start the agent, I refresh, and we can see these transactions have been sent. If I go to the Assignments tab and I search for these users, I can see those users are now inside the system. We also have some notification, so we have the ability to notify. There's 3 items here. We can send an email notification if we cannot contact SAS. We can send an email notification if we can't contact LDAP, and we can set an email notification if the group is missing. We also have the ability to browse our user source, so we can browse our users, and we can also browse our groups, and this is the particular group that I'm syncing. So again, just to review the SAS Sync agent for Active Directory, we download the BMC file from SAS, we install the agent and add the BMC file to the sync agent. We configure our connection to our Active Directory. We define our sync group. We set up email notifications. I find this is important because I sometimes, in the professional services side, I get people asking me, hey, how do we know if the group is there or not? Is there any way to know if it's been changed? And again, by defining the email notification, I find that it's quite important. We then start the sync agent. Inside SAS, we set the sync agent host to being allowed, and then we can go ahead and sync the users into SAS. So these are the settings inside the LDAP sync agent settings where we can define our options when downloading the BMC file. So as I mentioned, persist operators against sync leaves operator status with that user, and delayed sync has a 24-hour delay. When you're troubleshooting the SAS sync agent, there are a few things that can go wrong. The first item is that you have the wrong AD IP address, and you'll receive an error message that it could not connect. If you're using the wrong port, you'll receive an error message that it could not connect. The service account that you're using to read the schema, which is your user DN, if we don't provide the right details, we'll receive an error message that says invalid credentials. So you need to go back and modify these details. If the password for that service account is incorrect, we'll receive an error, invalid credentials. When we define our DNs, you will receive an error if there is no DN, so it's invalid, or if the DN is incorrect. Once the LDAP sync agent is up and running, there are a few error messages that you can receive. For example, if you're trying to sync more users than you have capacity in SAS, on the transaction details, you will receive an error message that says not enough capacity. Now, when we take a look at the log file, which is under your standard installation folder, program files, CryptoCard, Black Shield, LDAP sync, log directory, you'll see in this example at the very bottom, there are more users than capacity, 19 of 10. This tells me that I was trying to synchronize 19 users where I only have 10 capacity inside SAS. So watch out for this one. What I find in the past is rather than the customer creating a new group for SAS, calling it the SAS tokens and adding users, they may use an existing group where they're trying to sync an entire Active Directory with hundreds of thousands of users where SAS does not have the appropriate capacity to do so. The sync agent, we may receive an error message, which means that our connection on TCP 8456 is blocked between the agent and SAS. Again, looking in the log file, we can see here the transaction streamer, error connecting to server, connection denied. So simply by checking the firewalls, both on where the agent is installed and the firewalls between the agent and SAS, make sure that TCP 8456 is open. And again, the SAS agent is pushing this data to the cloud, so we need to make sure that those particular ports are open. Now, like I mentioned, when we make our first sync from the agent to SAS, the connection will be denied. And I find that this catches a lot of people where they make that first sync and nothing's happening and they're trying to figure out why. So it's important to take note here that the sync permission, when you see the word change permission, it means that effectively you need to set that permission for that agent to communicate. So when you click on that link and click allowed, like you've seen in the video, you will see that the sync permission will change to being allowed. Performing the sync, stopping and starting the agent, or waiting 20 minutes, which is the minimum interval, again, the sync agent will then post that group and user data into the cloud. So now we'll take a look at the sync agent using SQL. So again, I'm going to take my BMC file, I'm going to load it into the sync agent. I'm then going to click on configure. I'm going to configure my source. This time I'm using SQL, and I'm using a Microsoft SQL database. We define our host, our database name, our user account, and our password. Again, just like we have for LDAP sync agent, if any of these values are incorrect and it cannot connect, you will receive an error similar to what we have inside the LDAP sync agent. We have the ability to define a failover host. We're having multiple SQLs. So once we've made our connection, we need to pick which of our SQL mapping to use. Now, the default Black Shield user source cannot be modified. You will need to define a new mapping, and I'll show you that in just one second. So I'm using the Black Shield user source 2, and I finish this configuration. I now define my group. So in this case, my group is called SQL users. I can now take a look at my schema mapping. So as I mentioned, by default, the Black Shield user source is created for us when we install the agent. To modify any of these SQL statements, we will need to create a new schema mapping. So I've created one called source 2. Now there's 5 steps that we need to complete for our SQL mapping. One is for single user, user list, groups, users groups, and groups membership. And you can see the SQL statement that's being used for each of these 5 items. So the first one is for single users, where we have our username and user ID. We then have our user ID, username, first name, last name. We have our group's name. And we have our user groups, which is the user ID and our group's name. Again, like we have for the sync agent for LDAP, we have notification, again, if SQL is not there, if SAS cannot be contacted, or if the SQL group cannot be found. Again, we have the ability to browse the user source based on users, based on groups. Let me go ahead and stop and start the agent, and the user information will be synced into SAS. So to review the sync agents for SQL, again, we download the BMC file. We add the BMC file to the sync agent. We configure our connections to SQL. We define our sync group. We start the agent. We set the sync agent host to being allowed. And then we sync the SQL users to SAS. So one of the questions that I get quite often is, how do I remove an account? And the simplest way to explain removing an account in SAS is basically to perform the onboarding in reverse order. So make sure that we don't have any operators, we don't have any tokens that are assigned to users, we don't have any users, and we can effectively then remove that account inside SAS. To remove the account which has no capacity, no users, so 0 here, we simply click on remove, and that removes the account for us. If we try to remove an account where, if we try to remove an account where we have some tokens still inside the account, we will receive an error that states that this account has tokens, we cannot remove this account. So, are there any questions about what you've just seen? No questions?